mortality data from 1999 to 2013. So it's 14 years of mortality data. And they were noticing something really interesting in the data. So if you know, typically in an advanced economy, mortality rates are generally always going to decline unless there's an epidemic or a natural disaster or something horrible happens. Your mortality rates are always going to generally be going in the positive direction, going down. Life expectancy is going to go down. Going to go up, and mortality rates are going to go down. But from 1999 to 2013, even though that was true for every group, it was true for black folks, it was true for Latinx folks, it was true for most white folks, but there was one group of white folks for whom it wasn't true, and that was white, middle-aged, non-college educated, working-class white people. During the same period that literally every other demographic saw their mortality rates decline, this group saw their mortality rates skyrocket. Over a 13-year period, 500,000 excess deaths. 500,000 people who died who wouldn't have died if their mortality rates had gone in the same direction as every other group. And it wasn't just like they were having heart attacks or hardening of the arteries and strokes and stuff. These were people that were dying principally from three things: opioid overdoses, cirrhosis of the liver brought on by heavy drinking, and suicide. These were self-inflicted deaths. They're called them deaths of despair in the media. You probably heard that terminology. When I saw this study, I remember thinking, well, this is fascinating, because if the issue is just despair, if the issue is just I'm hurting and I'm in pain, then why aren't black and brown folks doing this? Because in every economic indicator, now I don't want to dismiss the pain that these white folks are in. They're suffering, don't get me wrong. There are millions of white folks struggling in this country post-recession, have not come out of it yet. I'm not dismissing that. But there is no way of denying that black and brown folks are worse off. Black wealth, 2/3 of black wealth was wiped out during the recession, mostly because of housing valuation that was wiped clean. So if it was just about pain and economic misery and anxiety and despair, black and brown folks would be doing opioids in those same numbers. They would be killing themselves. They would be drinking themselves to death, and they're not. So explain to me why white folks are having a harder time dealing with despair than black and brown folks. And when you think about that answer to that question, you have just answered the riddle of why privilege is a setup in this country. And you have just answered the riddle as to why white folks ought to care about issues of equity. Because you see, when the society tells you that all you got to do is work hard and everything will work out, because that's what we tell people. Luckily, most black and brown folks know it's more complicated than that. Most black and brown folks never had the luxury of believing that, but white folks did. Even those white working class men who worked in the assembly lines and the factories and the coal mines, right? They had at least the belief in horizontal mobility. Right? Which means what? My granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I'm gonna work in the mine. Or my grandfather worked on the assembly line, my father worked on the assembly line, I'm gonna get a job with the union and work on the assembly line. Even those working class white men who struggle every day had the ability to believe that things would always at least be static, if not better. No black person in this country, no person of color in this country ever took for granted that they would have a job ready for them if they were just hardworking and willing to lift things. People of color always knew better. White folks didn't. We had the luxury of not knowing our country. So when black folks come up against a setback like the recession, that's just like a more extreme version of Monday, y'all. Two-thirds of black wealth gets wiped clean, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty much how shit goes. Like, that's, ridiculous and horrible, but we know that. Like, that happens. And white folks have a setback, and all of a sudden we're facing double-digit unemployment, and we don't know what to do with that. Because to us, we haven't faced that since the Great Depression. We have no idea how to even cope with that level of setback. See, James Baldwin said it best. Many years ago, he said, talking about black folks, he said, I don't mean to sentimentalize suffering, but that man who can never suffer, and he used gender-specific language, but we could say specifically, the person who can never suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they really are. Because that man who is forced to snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rages to destroy it every day learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable, because in order to survive, in order to stay alive, he has to learn to look at the meaning beneath the words. And ultimately what Baldwin says is that when one is constantly surviving the worst that life has to bring, one ceases to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. And that's the difference. People of color are not afraid in this moment. It's white folks who are freaking out. We're the ones who don't know what to make of it. Whether it's white liberals who are freaking out over the politics of the moment, or it's white conservatives and working class folks in these towns like Western PA who are freaking out about cultural change and they don't know what to make of that. Whatever it is, like, we're all sort of in a system that we don't really understand, and that's actually set us up for this moment. And now we're suffering as a result of it. And white folks are not going to get the relief that they need in Western PA or Ohio or anywhere else in this country, following the siren song of somebody that tells them that black and brown folks are to blame because they're not the source of that problem. That's not why they're hooked on opioids. They're hooked on opioids because that's the way you dull your pain, the pain that you never thought was yours to experience. And Donald Trump is just a walking, talking human opioid because he comes along. Because what is an opioid, y'all? Pharmacologically now, just scientifically. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm talking pharmacology. This is science. What is an opioid? Opioid is a thing that only has one purpose. It blocks pain receptors. That's all it does. It doesn't actually fix your problem. If you have a crushed disc in your back, they will give you opioids to deal with the pain. That will not fix the disc. You will need surgery for that. If you have cancer, they might give you opioids to deal with the pain. That will not get rid of the cancer. You will need surgery and possibly chemotherapy in order to deal with that. Opioids just block the pain. That's what Donald Trump does. He comes along and he says, I can take away your pain and I can tell you what the source of it is. I can't actually fix it, but just take me. I alone, he said, I alone can fix your problem. He is OxyContin with a heartbeat. And these people who have been led to believe that they were never supposed to experience anxiety this way eat it up because we don't know how to deal with setback. That's fragility, as Robin DiAngelo refers to it in the white community. We don't know how to deal with setback. We've never had to deal with it on this level. That's not to say that individual white people have not, but it's to say that an awful lot of white folks had the luxury, the privilege of actually believing the lie of America. And we'd have been a hell of a lot better off if we had just listened to black folks all along and listen to brown folks all along. Our privilege is now killing us. Our privilege of obliviousness is putting us in the grave early. So I think there's a real obvious reason why white folks ought to care about this. And I think there's a really important reason why those of us who are wondering what we're going to do in this moment ought not lose hope. Here's how I know this.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're faring well where you are, and if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. Now, in this specific video, Tim Wise delivers very mind-provoking and thought-provoking conversation surrounding the topic of race. As we know, Tim Wise is a white activist with whom he fights, or rather he is in activism towards liberation of black justice, you know. He fights for black people in a nutshell. Now, in this specific video, Tim Wise delivers a scathing indictment of how fear is weaponized in American societies. The weaponizing of fear in American society is used to perpetuate systemic inequality, particularly against black Americans and other marginalized groups. With the skill of a seasoned storyteller and the intellectual rigor of a social critic like Tim Wise, he tries to deconstruct the historical and contemporary use of fear as a political tool, offering both a diagnosis and a call to action for those seeking justice. This man is an orator. He speaks and he delivers messages to institutions. He comes to churches. He goes to schools, right? He delivers, conversations surrounding the topic of equality. And in this specific video, he's going to speak on how the oppressors use fear to weaponize themselves, and they use fear to perpetuate systemic inequality. We have, sorry about this, we have individual racism, then we have systemic racism. Individual racism is as a result of systemic racism. Systemic racism gives room to the individual. It is not the other way around. And Tim Wise explains it better. I want us to listen to him. I shall get back by the end of the video where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in.
For the last 8 years, those of us who do racial justice work and racial equity work have been on a particular mission where we had one job, to be honest. Like, this was our job. For the last 8 years of the presidency of Barack Obama, our job as anti-racist was to actually convince white people that racism was still a thing. That was our gig for 8 years, because a lot of white folks were like, oh my God, it's so cool that racism is over. Because that black guy got elected and I totally voted for him. Which, first of all, no, you didn't, because the majority of white people never voted for Barack Obama. But, oh my God, it's so cool, racism's over. Which I'm sure the women in the room will recall that day in 1988 when patriarchy was smashed in Pakistan. And you didn't even let me finish the line. Don't bite the bars before I finish them, please. Like when patriarchy was smashed in Pakistan, because Benazir Bhutto, a woman, was elected head of state, right, in Pakistan. You do remember that, women, right? Like, all of you were thinking, holy hell, I need to move to Pakistan because things are good for women. They have a woman who's the head of state, right? Nobody did that. Like, even my child at the time, who didn't even exist and wouldn't exist for another 13 years, knew, even like 13 years before her birth, like, the election of a woman in Pakistan didn't mean anything about the eradication of male supremacy and domination in Pakistan. But in this country, that's what we assumed about Barack Obama. White folks were like, oh my God, I'm so glad we don't have to talk about that. So for 8 years, that was our gig. Trying to just hold white folks' hands. My people, my people, my people, my people. And convince them that racism was really a thing. Now, however exhausting that bullshit was for me, I can't even fathom how exhausting that was for the black and brown folks in this room, who had to go back to like reality 101 with some white folks, like, right? And yet that was the gig. So but I told you I was trying to tease the positive out of the negative. So here comes the positive. And like I said, I'm not saying this is persuasive. I'm just giving you the best I got, trying to find the silver lining. The good news is, for the last 8 years, we've been having to hold people's hand and prove that racism was a real thing. The good news is, I guess we don't have to do that shit anymore. Yeah, like I said, it's not real persuasive, because if the best evidence you have that things are good is the fact that things are more blatant now, if the best evidence you have that things are good is that middle school children are taunting other middle school children who happen to be Latinx with chants of build the wall, if the best evidence you have that things are better is that things are blatant because white nationalists and neo-Nazis and white supremacists are running over people in Charlottesville, the best evidence you have that things are better because they're more blatant and therefore more obvious is that we have multiple hate crimes, murders happening in New York and in College Park, Maryland, and all across this country, in Kansas, right? And you've got a dude walking into the Walmart in Thornton, which is how far from here? Not far. And shooting up Latinx folks. They didn't even report that the first 3 days after the crime. They didn't even tell you that he targeted Latinx folks and actually shot them on purpose and had a history of abusing Latinx folks in his apartment complex, or wherever the hell it was he lived, that he was actually openly hostile to them. They didn't tell you that. In between, the dude in New York who happens to be Muslim and ran over folks with his truck, we heard about that. And we ascribed that to his religion. This dude, Scott Ostrom, they tell you finally in the reports, had stacks of Bibles in his house. No furniture, but stacks of Bibles. A futon and a bunch of Bibles. Now, if it was a stack of Qurans, I have a feeling that we'd been having a different conversation in this country about Scott Ostrom. But you can have a stack of Bibles and be a white man and go and shoot Latinx folks, and they don't call it even call it a hate crime, let alone an act of terrorism. See, that's the country in which we live, and that is not even in my notes, but it needed to be said. And so, it's not really a silver lining, is it? Because if The silver lining is things are more blatant now, and now we can't really ignore it, but people have to die in order for us to not ignore it. That's not really progress. But at least it does tell us one thing. If you can't see it now, you're never going to see it. And I can't waste my time on you. And I can't bother with trying to convert you. At some point, you're going to have your own come to Jesus moment before you realize the evidence right in front of you that black and brown folks have been trying to tell all of us in the white community forever and that we've been ignoring. Because if you cannot see it now, you are not going to see it. And the rest of us have to move on without you and build a movement without you. And you'll either join up or you won't. You'll either figure it out or you won't. But there comes a point where we cannot pander to those who can't even see the obviousness in front of them. There comes a point where we have to treat people like adults and tell them to act like such and not as children, despite their age, and act as though we have an obligation to show them the light. The light is real clear for those who are willing to open their eyes, so we just have to do our work. You know? But here's what really concerns me. And this is actually a bigger concern than all of that which I just said. I'm really concerned that when we have this resurgence of overt bigotry that we can all look around and that we can see, it makes it especially easy for the rest of us in the white community. I don't mean the racist overtly. I don't mean the white supremacist. I don't mean the neo-Nazis. I mean the nice white liberal folks, for what that's worth. And I've been white a long time, so let me assure you, it is worth nothing. It allows those of us who are nice white liberals to separate ourselves from those folks, right? It allows us to claim distance from them. It allows us to say, thank God we're not like those people in Charlottesville. Thank God we're not like David Duke. We're not like Richard Spencer. We're not like Matt Heimbach. We're not like Andrew Anglin. We're not like those dudes in Charlottesville marching around with their tiki torches. Because, you know, nothing says white supremacy like white boys walking around with oversized Polynesian candles trying to be badass. Nothing is more badass than that. And wearing polo shirts and khakis, because that's intimidating as hell. Right? But see, we like to, and I just made fun of them because it was fun to do, but we don't need to separate ourselves from them. When white liberal and progressive people do that, we actually become part of the problem. Right? This idea that, oh my God, thank God we're not like them. Those are the racist white people, and we're the good white people. But here's what I know for a fact. David Duke and Richard Spencer and Matt Heimbach and Andrew Anglin and those boys in Charlottesville, I'll tell you what they're not to blame for. They might be to blame for the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, but I'll tell you what they're not to blame for. They're not to blame for the fact that right now the typical white family in America has 12 times the net worth of the typical black family in America. They're not to blame for that. They're not to blame for the fact that the typical white family has 10 times the net worth of the typical Latinx family. They're not to blame for that. That's about history and the accumulated advantage of some and the disadvantage of others. And David Duke wasn't in a position to make that happen. Richard Spencer wasn't in a position to make that happen. They're not to blame for the fact that black households headed by college graduates have less wealth on average by about 1/3 than white households headed by a high school dropout. Let me repeat that. That black households headed by a college graduate have 1/3 less wealth than white households headed by somebody that didn't even finish 12th grade. So tell me again the piece about how education is the great equalizer, please. And how if black folks just valued education enough and did what they were supposed to do and played by the rules, they would be at the same level as white people. Tell me that again while you reflect on that data, which nobody's told you until tonight. Nobody running for office, nobody asking for your vote has told you that. But that's the truth, and David Duke didn't do it. Richard Spencer didn't do it. Matt Heimbach didn't do it. Andrew Anglin didn't do it. The Klan didn't do it. They're not to blame for the fact that right now, unarmed black folks, 3.2 times more likely than unarmed white folks to be shot by police, even when they are not aggressing against the officers. That's not David Duke. He didn't have a badge and a gun. It's not Richard Spencer. He doesn't have a badge and a gun. That's just average, everyday white folks on police forces around this country, and black folks unarmed 3.2 times more likely to be shot by police than white folks. See, that's on us. That's not on them. That's on us because we've remained silent in the face of that black death and that brown death. We've remained silent. We haven't done enough. We haven't said enough. We like to put it on Nazis, though, because we're not Nazis. Thank God we're not Nazis. We're smart enough to not vote for Nazis. If the best thing you can say for yourself is that you know better than to vote for Nazis, you need to start over again, right? The best thing that we can say about ourselves is that we're good enough not to be white nationalists marching with tiki torches in Charlottesville defending Confederate statues. We need to start over again because these problems are systemic and they got nothing to do with Nazis. They have to do with us. They have to do with our neighbors. They have to do with our family. They have to do with our colleagues and our friends and people that we know and live around. And they might have to do with us. David Duke and Richard Spencer are not to blame for the fact that right now black folks are 13% of drug users, but 37% of people arrested and incarcerated for a drug offense. That's not on David Duke. They're not to blame for the fact that right now in the state of Colorado, y'all got some white folks getting rich. Real rich. Real rich. Selling the same product on the same block. On the same block that black and brown folks were selling the same product on 10 years ago, and they're still doing time right now in prisons in this state. David Duke didn't cause that. But you got some white weed millionaires making money selling the same product and doing it with like tasting notes and shit. Why the hell you need tasting notes with your weed? What the hell? Why you like notes of apricot and shit? Like, why can't you just smoke weed? Like, just don't tell me what kind of cheese to pair my weed with. I don't need to pair weed with cheese. I got Cheetos. That's all I need to pair my weed with. How the hell did white people gentrify weed? Like, it's bad enough you gentrified the neighborhood, then you just like gentrified the product. You're like, watch this. And that's not in the notes either, but I mean, honest to God, right? So David Duke's not to blame for that disparity. David Duke's not to blame for any of that. Richard Spencer's not to blame for any of that. And I didn't need any of that data, by the way, that I just shared with you to tell me that the war on drugs wasn't about drugs. I could have told you that from personal experience, and I can tell you this now because the statute of limitations has expired and they cannot touch me. So 30 years ago, I'm coming back from I was in college at Tulane in New Orleans, and I'm coming back from a college debate tournament that was held in San Antonio, driving back in a rental car from San Antonio to New Orleans. And I get stopped for speeding about 13 miles over the speed limit in Gonzales, Texas. I don't recommend this, by the way. I don't know if you've been to Gonzales. Like, one person is like, oh hell, I know where this story's going. Holy hell, Gonzales, Jesus, this is gonna be terrible. I get stopped in Gonzales, and officer comes to and I'm nervous because a couple of reasons. Number one is nobody likes getting stopped by cops. Like, even white people, we don't like it. We know it's different than black and brown folks, but like, we don't like it either. Like, nobody likes getting stopped by the cop because, you know, for white people, they might actually give you a ticket. Obviously, for black and brown folks, the concern is quite a bit more than that. But nonetheless, we're still nervous as hell, right? So I'm nervous, but I'm specifically nervous because I know what's in the car. And I don't mean debate evidence, right? It's me and my debate partner and then another two-person team and the coach, 5 people in the rental car. And I know that in the briefcase of the coach is 2.5 ounces of weed. Oh, it gets worse. 2.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of cocaine, 12 sheets of acid, and 16 hits of ecstasy. Y'all think about that for a minute. For those of you, I like how every time I tell this story, though, what's funny, literally every time I tell this story, there are white folks in the audience who are like, oh yeah, oh hell yeah. Like, they're really excited for me, like I'm carrying on me tonight. Like, y'all, this shit was 30 years ago, settle down. Like, this is not, and my asthma came back, so I don't do this anymore. Like, this is an old story, so just settle down. Y'all got weed chops, just take care of yourself. I got nothing for you. But anyway, we got a lot of drugs in the car. And if y'all don't know about illegal narcotics and you don't understand what all those references were and how much drugs that really is, like, let me just assure you, whatever you understand about personal consumption, yeah, that's way more than you could possibly consume. So that's enough that if they catch you with it, you will go down for possession with intent to distribute. Trust me. So I'm nervous because they pulled me over and I know that's what's in the car. And so the cop comes to the window and he says, I need to see your license and registration. I'm like, well, it's a rental car. Here's the registration information and I'll get my license. And so I pull my wallet out and I'm looking for it. I can't find it. Having a hell of a time finding it. I can't find it. And it's mostly because I'm nervous and I'm starting to sweat. It's been like 4 seconds since he came to the window and I'm already like, oh my God, oh my God. And it felt like it took 3 weeks. It probably was like a minute and a half at most, right? But it felt like it was 3 weeks and I cannot find my license. And at one point he says, so do you want to come back to the police cruiser and try to find it there? The light's better there. And I'm thinking, I don't really want to go back there, but you've offered it and I guess I'm going, so yeah, I'll go. And my voice cracked like I was 13 and going through puberty again. So I go back, I'm nervous as hell. He can obviously tell I'm nervous. I go and sit in his car. By the way, if you've never had the pleasure of sitting in the front of a police cruiser, he was right. The lighting is way better in there. You can see every damn thing in there. And I'm sitting there trying to find my license and I still can't find it. I keep looking and I keep looking and I keep looking and I cannot find it. And I'm obviously fumbling and I'm obviously nervous. But I turn the little plastic, things that you keep your credit cards and stuff in. And at one point, but I do come across my fake ID because that's important. And he sees it and he goes, isn't that it? And I'm like, no, no! I don't know what that is. I have no idea. That's like an arts and crafts project or some shit that I did for fun, for extra credit. I don't know what, even though it said Maine driver's license on it. The reason it said Maine, as in the state of Maine, driver's license, is that we were in Louisiana and we figured nobody knows what the hell a Maine driver's license even looks like, so we can just make this up and nobody's gonna know that it's fake, But he looked at it, he said, isn't that it? I'm like, no, 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 no. And he starts to reach for it. And just as he starts to reach for it, I find the actual Tennessee license. And I pull it out. And here it is. And he goes, are you sure that's the one you want to go with? And I said, yeah, I'm really sure. This is definitely the one. I'd like to stick with this one. Thank you. Yes. I'm totally going to stick with this one. Thank you, if that's okay. And he goes, that's fine. And he writes a number down. And he issues me a $75 ticket, and he sends me on my way. Now, if you believe that that would have worked out that way, if I had been black or brown in Gonzales, Texas, or anywhere in this country in 1987 or yesterday, you are not paying attention. And I do not mean to this lecture, I mean to life in your country. Because in fact, if I had displayed that level of nervousness, if I had demonstrated very clearly in his presence a fake ID that his comment signifies he knew was fake, that's why he asked me if I wanted to go with that one versus the other one. If you think that a person of color would have been treated the same way, you're not paying attention, which is my long way of telling you that the only reason I'm standing in front of you today and the only reason that you know who in the hell I am is because of white privilege and the institutional racism. And the institutional racism of the drug war, because otherwise I did hard time for at least 20 years, if not still today, in the state of Texas for drug possession with intent to distribute. So that's an important thing to note when we think about crime and fear and who we fear and who we don't fear and where we are as a country. And none of that is about David Duke. And none of that is about guys that burn crosses in the night. None of that's about guys that wear swastikas on their sleeve. And none of that's about skinheads. That's about a culture that we as a society haven't done enough to eradicate, that is run by people who are by and large, at least overtly, appalled by those people I just mentioned, and yet they do the bidding of them every day. And we need to be clear about that. It's not white nationalists, at least not in the overt sense, who are attacking those football players who are taking a knee peacefully on Sundays. That's just average, everyday white folks, isn't it? That's just average folks. And I didn't intend to speak about this, but about 6 weeks ago, I realized I had no choice, because I started to realize that this whole thing that's going on with the NFL and the reaction from some quarters of the white community to what is going on with these protests is like the perfect metaphor for the racial divide in this country. You cannot get any more perfect than this. This actually is a metaphor for the whole history of the divide between white folks and people of color in this country. Because what you have is people of color raising their voice against demonstrable injustice, provable injustice, injustice for which there's no rebuttal. And then you got white folks saying, y'all have lost your mind and you're upsetting my day. Which is exactly what white folks said when the sit-ins hit Nashville, where I'm from. I know because my grandmother was one of them. My mom's mom was one of them. She wasn't a bigot. She was never one of those white people that would have yelled at black children as they were integrating a formerly all-white school. That would have been tacky. And if there was one thing that white women in the early 1960s in the South valued, it was class. So she would never have been one of those white people, but she was the kind of white person that when the sit-in struck in Nashville 2 weeks after they began in Greensboro on Feb 4 or Feb 1 of 1960, 2 weeks later they hit Nashville, and her thing is, I wanted to go shopping downtown, but I'm not going to be able to now. Why do they have to do this? If I go shopping, there might be a riot. Oh my God, when am I going to get to go shopping again? It's just the inconvenience of it all. You know, it's just the inconvenience of raising issues of injustice. My God, why do you have to put us out? Well, because if protest doesn't inconvenience you, it's not working. That's sort of the point. So when you say some stupid shit like, I just want to watch the game on Sunday, why can't I just watch the game? I just want to watch the game. Ansley Heheart, who actually makes other Fox News hosts look intelligent, she actually said this like 2 weeks ago. She says, I just want to eat pizza and popcorn and watch football. First of all, like, upgrade your Sunday food. First of all, like if what you're eating during a game is football and like pizza and popcorn, what the hell? Like, do better. First of all, like just on a pure snack level, like come on, like come on, like. But beyond that, like, what does that mean? It's just a white person whining about how black folks are putting her out, reminding her of stuff she doesn't be reminded of at a time when she doesn't want to be reminded of it. This is the whole history of America, is black folks raising issues and white folks saying there isn't really a problem. Y'all are seeing things. That's the perfect metaphor. This isn't about the flag. It's not about the national anthem. Although if you know the history of the national anthem, it damn well ought to be about the national anthem. If you actually knew the history of that song and you still wanted to sing it, there's a problem with you. Because Francis Scott Key was a vicious white supremacist and defender of slavery. And the third verse of that song, which none of y'all learned growing up, I didn't learn it growing up. They didn't teach it to us, but it was in the song until the 1920s, until they finally took it out, because it didn't quite sound right. Right? The third verse of that song is a revenge fantasy. A white supremacist revenge fantasy, in theory, against the British, because that song was written during the War of 1812 after the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore. But in actual language, you read the lyrics, it's a revenge fantasy against black folks enslaved who were insufficiently patriotic and sided with the British, because the British said, if you fight for us, we'll free you. And in Maryland, they weren't going to do that. So when black folks weren't sufficiently patriotic in defending a system that enslaved them, Francis Scott Key fantasized in the third verse about the blood of slaves running in the streets of Baltimore. That's the history of that song. So even though that's not what the football players are protesting, it damn well ought to be what we're protesting every single day, because as a national song, that's a pathetic excuse for an anthem. But that's not what they're not complaining about the military. Good Lord, what kind of ignorance does it take to believe these are protests about the military? Well, let's think about it. I mean, these are people that are protesting, and Colin Kaepernick told you why he was doing it. Everybody's told you. It's about inequality in the justice system, which is to say it's about the disparate treatment of black folks in the justice system in particular, which is a direct violation of this little thing in the Constitution called the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of that amendment, which is to say not only is this protest not disrespecting the military, keep in mind who the soldiers actually took a pledge and took an oath to defend. They didn't take an oath to defend the flag. No soldier ever died for a flag. If you think soldiers died for the flag, you're a sucker, and so were they. They didn't die for a flag. They didn't die for a song. They actually take an oath to the Constitution of the United States. That's the only thing that they actually pledge any oath to. So that means that not only are the soldiers not disrespecting them, but that any soldier who took their oath seriously would take a knee with them every week to actually protest the inequalities of the justice system. And if you're not willing, if you're a soldier that's not willing to take a knee on behalf of the Constitution, then please do not lecture the rest of us about how we're disrespecting your service. You took an oath, defend it. But see, we can't hear that. White America writ large. I'm not talking about every white person. I want to be clear now. I'm talking about white America writ large as a corporate entity. Because you know we're a corporate entity. We have incorporation papers and shit. Like, it's a real formal thing. White America is a formal thing. Not all white folks are bought into it, and some people of color are. But I'm just saying, that's true now. It's true. White supremacy is a system that works on the colonized. You don't just colonize people's lands, you colonize their minds. So white supremacy can work on anybody, right? Mostly works on my folks, but it can work on other people. There are women that internalize sexism and misogyny, right? There are LGBTQ folks that internalize straight supremacy and cisgendered supremacy. There are poor folks who hate themselves for being poor, right? It's not just about the dominant group internalizing superiority. It's about marginalized groups internalizing their own inferiority. So it happens. But my point is that we don't, by and large, particularly in the white community, want to hear any of this, because to us, we can't see through the lens of black and brown America. We can't understand that, and this is the metaphor of the NFL protest. It's about white folks not being able to see the reality that people of color live. So when black folks take that knee on Sunday, it's like, how dare you? That doesn't even make sense to us. And especially because you're a spoiled millionaire that makes all this money. Because white folks really don't like it when black folks make more money than us. In case y'all hadn't noticed, we have a real problem with that. We have no problem with white folks that make more money than us, because we think eventually we're going to be them. So if Colin Kaepernick has an $11 million contract, which he had last year, he doesn't have it now. But he had an $11 million contract, and folks lost their mind. How dare he? Ungrateful. Find another country where you could make $11 million throwing a ball around. Okay. And Donald Trump, find another country where you could take over a real estate portfolio worth $237 million from your daddy in the early 1980s, when property in New York was cheap and the city was bankrupt. Find another country where you could inherit that kind of wealth and become a billionaire, please. And when you find that country, feel free to move to it, because there is no such place. But we don't make the same judgment for him. See, white folks can criticize America. Black folks cannot. Patriotism is for black people. Did y'all not know that? Patriotism is for people of color. Patriotism is what people of color have to show just to be appreciative of all they've been given. That's what folks said when these protests struck off. all that we've given you. And then folks were like, y'all are just ungrateful. All you do is play ball. Well, all y'all do is buy tickets to see us play ball. So at some point, feel free to stop buying tickets, stop buying jerseys, stop going to the games, or play the damn game yourself and see if anybody comes to see your pathetic ass throw a ball around and run down the field. But when white folks complain about America, white people can actually make a whole campaign slogan and a pretty little hat that's based on a criticism of America. Because when I make a hat that says, "Make America Great Again," did I not just pretty much tell you that my opinion of America is that it sucks right now? Like, that's pretty much the implicit message of that hat. The message is America sucks and needs to be made great again, because right now it's terrible. If a black person were to say that, if a brown person were to say that, if a person of color of any kind were to say that, folks would call them unpatriotic, ungrateful, hateful, tell them to find another country. A white dude says that and white folks will make him president. That tells you all you need to know about this country. But that's the whole metaphor of race in America. People of color say something's wrong and white folks are like, y'all are seeing things. We don't understand what you're talking about. My goodness, we can't even get our head around it. And if this were just a common, like, modern phenomena, maybe we could write it off to mere ignorance. People just don't know, right? And I get it. Like, I get it if you're like 17 or something and you just haven't really been exposed to the reality of this. I can understand your ignorance. But see, there's a difference between ignorance just like in the formal sense, right? Ignorance in like the grammatical, just formal definitional sense of that word is just not knowing some stuff, right? And when you're just ignorant about some stuff, it's no big deal. Like if I give you some information that fills in the gaps of your knowledge about stuff you don't know, there's no reason to get pissy about it. You just go, oh my gosh, that was really, I appreciate you helping me out with that. I didn't understand. Like I'm ignorant about like physics and stuff, calculus, all kinds of math beyond like 7th grade, you know? So if you like told me how to do like calculus really easily, I would be so appreciative. I'd be like, oh my God, I had no idea it was that easy, thank you. Oddly enough, when you tell people about white supremacy and its reality in America, they don't thank your ass for that. They don't actually go like, oh my God, thank you for filling in the gaps of my information. They get angry because this isn't a new phenomenon. This is intergenerational, right? The idea that white folks can't hear this black and brown truth, it's an intergenerational thing. So you can go back to the early 60s, 1961, when the freedom rides and the sit-ins were in full swing. Now this is stuff that in retrospect we look back on and we think of those people as some of the greatest freedom fighters in the history of this country, don't we? Like they're secular saints now. We look back at the freedom riders and we look back at the sit-in activists, and we look back at Dr. King, and we look back at all these folks, and we view them as secular saints. But in 1961, when polls were taken, 70% of white Americans said the sit-ins and the freedom riders were doing the wrong thing, and their actions were going to be more hurtful than helpful, and they were unnecessary. That's what 70% of white folks said. 70% of white folks were like, there's no need for this. It's messing up my day. In 1962, Gallup asked white folks, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Come on, it's 62, y'all. The answer is no. It's real easy. In retrospect, nobody would get this question wrong. But in 1962, 85 out of 100 white folks answered yes. 85% of white folks were like, oh yeah, everything's fine. 1963, Gallup asked white folks, do you think blacks are treated equally in your community in housing, education, and employment? Again, it's 1963, y'all. This is not a hard quiz. This is not difficult. This is not the GRE. This is some real basic American history shit. And in retrospect, we all know the answer is no. Of course, black folks weren't being treated equally. The Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed yet. The Voting Rights Act hadn't been passed yet. The Fair Housing Act was 5 years away from being passed. It's the high watermark of the movement. It's the year of the March on Washington. It's the year that Medgar Evers gets shot down dead in his driveway in Jackson. It's the year that George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama and says, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's the high watermark of American apartheid. And when white folks were asked, do you think blacks are treated equally, 2/3 of us said, of course, everything is fine. So what do I make of it? See, because I think most of those white folks were decent people, in spite of their ignorance. I think they were mostly decent folks. I don't think they were hateful people, mostly bigoted people. I think they were mostly decent people. But the fact is, decent people caught up in iniquitous systems get twisted and don't understand the reality in which they live. And so as a result, the vast majority of white folks, despite their best intentions, didn't see what was obvious. Now, here's the thing. If white folks didn't see it in 61 and didn't see it in 62 and didn't see it in 63, why in the hell would I trust white people, and why should you trust white folks to tell you when racism exists in 2017? Why in the hell would you do that? Because any white person that questions the reality of racism in 2017 reminds me of their parents and their grandparents who said the same thing when it was blatant. People of color have always seen it, and they've always been right. White folks have never seen it, and we've always been wrong. And I have a hard time believing that suddenly we figured it all out and black and brown folks lost their mind. I have a hard time believing that's what happened. But when these black folks take a knee, that's basically what we're saying. What are you complaining about? What in the world are you complaining about? But it's the very same thing that was said. There's never been any point where white America endorsed black protest. Not one time in this country's history can you point to a time when white folks on the whole believed that black protest was justified, even in the 60s, when now, in 1966, Gallup did a poll where they asked white folks what they thought about black protest, and literally like 75% of white folks said that if they were black in America, they wouldn't be protesting anymore by 1966. This coming from people that lost their mind over some taxes on tea, y'all. White folks were like, you taxed our tea. No damn way we're dumping that shit in the harbor and we're starting a revolution. But if y'all are lynching us and like denying our equal right, no, we're not gonna protest that. But some tea taxes, oh no, hell no. Right? I mean, this is ridiculous. Right? But this is sort of where we're at. And I just want us to think about what it means that white America, by and large, has never been able to see. It's also about, I think, important to understand that this manipulation of white public opinion around the NFL protests is also part of a political strategy. And let's be very clear about that. There's a reason this is what Donald Trump keeps talking about. There was an article in Politico just a couple days ago. Y'all ought to read it. It's about, there was a reporter that went to Pennsylvania, went to Western PA, right, and started interviewing Trump voters about how they felt a year out. And you know, here's the thing, like most people, it doesn't matter who you voted for. Like most people, you could be liberal, you could be conservative, you could be a Democrat, you could be a Republican, you could be anything else. Most people will never admit they screwed up. Right? It's just a psychological thing. Like most people just aren't going to do it. Like, you know, it's not just those folks. Like most of us are just not going to do it. Like somebody that we voted for could totally start a war and we'd act like it hadn't happened. Like that's honest to God, that's the truth. The psychology of it is we just don't admit when we mess up, because then we have to own the mistake and it's hard. And so I get it. But anyway, the Politico reporter goes out to Western PA, goes to Johnstown, which is outside of Pittsburgh. And he's talking to these folks, like multiple generations in the mining industry or whatever. And he asked them sort of how things are a year later, and they're like, oh, everything sucks. Oh, it's a shithole. Like, we're still in the same position we were in a year ago. Nothing's really changed. Everything's horrible. And he's like, oh, well, then you must, like, put that on the president, right? Oh, no. No, it's not the president. No, we still support the president 100%. And he goes through this whole process of how that is, right? And really, you should read the article. I mean, I'm going to summarize it. But essentially, you listen to what they say. And it's rather obvious that what they find endearing about this president, they say things like, well, I just like the fact, you know, that what he's doing on immigration. And the reporter says, well, he hasn't built the wall, and he's not going to build the wall. It's not really going to happen. He's like, I don't even give a shit if he builds the wall. It's just the fact that he knows they don't belong here, right? So it's more about the pose than the actual policy. It's more about saying they don't belong. It's more about finding an enemy and reminding people who the enemy is than actually getting anything done. So they all say, well, like, he hasn't brought any jobs back. It's like, I didn't expect him to. Oh, but they told us that's why you voted for him, was because of economic anxiety and the need for jobs. That's what they told us. He's like, well, we didn't expect him to really bring jobs back. We know we're never going to get those jobs back. Coal jobs aren't coming back, right? But at one point, the most ubiquitous thing that these folks said, the reporter says, is that it was about the NFL protest. It was about this idea that this was symbolic for them of something bigger than anything that would actually improve their lives. Just having a president who pointed to an enemy and said, that's who you should hate because they make millions of dollars and you don't. And they make millions of dollars just playing a game. Imagine that. And y'all are struggling to survive. It was just that attitude. It was just basically, essentially what these folks were acknowledging was that their entire vote for this man was about flipping off people they didn't like. It was the political equivalent of a ball grab, right? It's about guys just grabbing, you know what I mean, right? And saying, F all y'all. That's basically what this is. And they all but said it. So when he starts talking about NFL players, he knows exactly what he's doing. We can make fun of him on Twitter, and we can talk about why don't you just do your job and do stuff, but the fact is he's doing what he thinks his job is. And it's the oldest play in the playbook of this country, which is rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Because that is the oldest play in the book. That's not new. People act like this is some unprecedented stuff. You'll hear people say that. You'll hear liberal folks say that, my God, we've never seen anything like this. This is unprecedented. And black folks are like, have y'all been paying attention to, like, if y'all saw that SNL sketch like the week after the election, y'all remember when Chris Rock came back and Dave Chappelle hosted and they did that sketch with those white people and they had their one black friend who was Dave Chappelle, of course, because if you had one black friend, it would be Dave Chappelle. And they were in the Brooklyn flat watching the returns. You remember this sketch? And there was like, the white folks were just confident. They were just like, we got this, we got this. Hillary Clinton is gonna be the first female president, it's a great night. And Chappelle's like, yeah, it's gonna be an interesting night. Because Dave Chappelle's character knew something about this country that his white friends didn't want to acknowledge, which was it wasn't nearly as easy as they thought it was. And then the returns start to come in and one of the white folks says, well, of course Kentucky went for Trump. I mean, that's where all the racists live. And Chappelle's character says, really, all the racists live in Kentucky? Is that right? And he's like, well, of course. And then returns keep coming in and they get Vermont. Vermont goes for Secretary Clinton. And the white folks are all excited. Well, Vermont. And Chappelle says, oh, snap, with their 4 electoral college votes, that's really going to make a difference. And then the returns keep coming in, and finally, when it's obvious that Trump has won, Chris Rock's character comes in, and the white folks are like, this is the most racist thing that's ever happened in America. And Chappelle's character says, yeah, my great-grandfather told me about that, but what did he know? He was a slave. In other words, the point of this sketch, right, which was brilliantly conceived and written, was to say to white folks, y'all got knocked off stride by this because y'all actually didn't know the country you lived in. And people of color always knew the country they lived in, and if we had been listening to them, maybe we could have kept it from becoming the country that it is. But we didn't want to listen. We didn't want to listen, and we didn't want to hear the reality of who we were. And so now Donald Trump is playing the same tune that everybody's been playing. You go back to the colonies, this is the oldest play in the book. Rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies. There's no such thing as white people in the colonies. European people didn't love each other. We hated each other. We spent most of our time killing each other. That was the whole history of Europe, was basically killing each other and looking for who the witch was. That's pretty much European history. I mean, honest to God, I'm just saying, like that. That's pretty much what we did. Oh, I need that water, thank you. We just looked for the witch and kill folks. And all of a sudden in the colonies, there's no white people, The Anglos hated the Irish hated the Anglo, the Germans hated everybody hated them right back. The Northern Italians didn't even think the Southern Italians were Italians, right? There was no European unity. This wasn't one big happy family. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1700s, it becomes necessary to create this thing called the white race. Why did that happen? Well, because the landowners looked around and they could do math. And the landowners looked around and they realized, my God, man, we got all these African enslaved folks and these European indentured servants, and pretty soon they're going to figure out we're screwing all of them, so we better figure out something to get some of these people on our side, or otherwise they're going to take our stuff. So all of a sudden you got these rich folks telling these poor landless peasants who were of European descent that they're better than even the highest black person. They don't have anything. They don't own any human beings. They don't own slaves. They don't own the shirt on their back, but you're going to make them think that they do, like W.E.B. Du Bois would later call it the psychological wage of whiteness. The idea that you may not have much, but at least you're not black. You may not have much, but at least you're not brown. You may not have much, but at least you're not a person of color. And so, in effect, you extend these little advantages. You let white folks vote, at least if they're men. You let them own land, and you put the white men on the slave patrol. And you get rid of indentured servitude, and you tell these white men that don't have a pot to piss in, you're going to be our eyes and our ears. You're going to keep your eyes open on those black folks. You're going to tell us when they're trying to escape. You're going to be the buffer between us and them. These white folks are like, oh, okay, man, I'm on the team, right? And all of a sudden, those rebellions that had begun to foment in the 1600s between black and white folks working together start to dissipate, because now these rich folks have convinced poor folks that they have more in common with rich folks than other poor folks. That's white supremacy. Fast forward to the Confederacy. That's what the rich white folks in the South, my part of the country, said. They all openly acknowledged why they wanted to secede. They didn't lie about it because they had no shame about it. We lie about it now. And John Kelly can go on national television and lie about it. And he knows he was lying. He knows full damn well that the Civil War was not caused by a lack of a willingness to compromise. He knows. But he's pandering to part of Donald Trump's base that believes that marinates in white rage and political anger. And so what's the reality? The South, my people told y'all. Like, we just told y'all. We didn't have any shame about it. We just stood up and said, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said, the cornerstone of our new government is the great truth that the Negro is not the equal of the white man. He said that. I didn't say that. I didn't put those words in his mouth. He said it. We got people lying about it now, but he was clear about it then. Every state that seceded told y'all why they left, and they told you it was about the desire to maintain slavery and extend it into the territories that had been captured to the west. They all said that. They gave no other reason, not one other reason but that. And yet here's the problem. Rich folks don't have any intention of going to war to fight for their own property. Rich folks not going to go to fight to protect their interest in slave ownership. They're going to get poor people to do that. Right? Rich people don't go to war. Rich people get poor people to go to war. Rich people get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they don't have to go to Vietnam. That's what rich people do. And so the rich came to the poor in the South and said, y'all need to go fight this war. And you would think that's ridiculous. Like, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my interest in the ownership of human beings when you don't even own any human beings? Why would you do that? That's not your ownership. That's not your property. That's my property. Y'all not going to come fight for my house? Like, if a military army invaded my block next week, I don't think I could call any of y'all and be like, hey, listen, there's an army invading my block. I have no intention of fighting to protect my own house. I'm going to sit on the back porch and drink mint juleps. But I would greatly appreciate it if you would come and defend my shit for me. Like, none of y'all are going to be like, I like that speech you gave in Denver. I'll be there in a minute. Like, none of y'all are going to do that. No matter how much you like what I have to say, you're going to be like, you need to defend your own shit. Like, that's what you're going to do. But the rich came to the poor and said, y'all need to do it. And the poor were like, okay. Why? Because the rich told the poor, if you don't do this, they're going to take your jobs. No, fool, they already have your job. That's how the market works. If they have to pay $1 a day for you to work on the farm and they can get a slave to do it for nothing, guess who got the job? Free got the job. In other words, the slave system actually underbid white labor, and you'd have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow aristocracy rather than defending aristocracy. But once again, rich people told poor people, your enemies are black and brown. And now we got the same thing with the wall and the issue of immigration. We got somebody saying, oh, white people, your jobs will come back if we just build the wall. For real, is that how you think capitalism works? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and it's like, oh my God, we got to give everybody a raise. They figured it out. I think that's what every CEO's like. I hope they don't think about the wall, because if they just think about building a wall, we're screwed. We're going to have to empty our profits to give bigger wages. No, that's not how capitalism is rooted in the notion of free markets that allow the mobility of money. And if you allow a system that allows mobility of capital, which is still going to be allowed, no matter if they could build a wall tomorrow, theoretically, and I say theoretically because if you've ever been on the border, you know that shit is not practical. Like, there are rivers and mountains and stuff. I mean, people that say you can build a wall on the American-Mexico border, U.S.-Mexico border, have never been there, number one. But theoretically, you could build one. That's not going to stop capital from moving, right? It's not like the wall exists in cyberspace. And all of a sudden, you're like, oh, I'm going to move some money to the Cayman Islands. I'm going to move some money to the Cayman Islands. Hit send. Boink, it hit the wall. Oh, my God, what happened? Damn it, I should have done it before they built the wall. That's not how the wall works. If the capital can still move and the goods can still move, but labor can't move, if you allow capital to be mobile and goods to be mobile, but you don't allow labor to be mobile, guess what you just did? By definition, this is Econ 101. This is not complicated stuff, right? You just tilted the game in favor of capital and against labor every time. Labor would be better off to have a more militant and larger working class in this country fighting for better wages and living standards and benefits than trying to keep folks on different sides of an artificial wall. But it's perfect politically because you can tell people that's why you don't have a job, because those people have taken your job, right? Which I find fascinating. Took my job. Whenever somebody tells me that Mexican, that black person, they took my job, my thing is like, did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have that job, that shit was not yours, right? Like I might be more sympathetic to people who say that if like they got the call on Monday from the boss and they were like, hey, John, congratulations, you're hired. And then like on Wednesday, the phone rings and they were like, no, just kidding, I'm giving it to Jose, goodbye. Like that would be unfair. I would be upset. Like I could get a little upset about that. That'd be unfair, it seemed cruel, right? But that's not what's happening. It's not like some dairy farmer in Iowa was waking up at 4 in the morning to go milk the cows, walking out to the barn, gets out there to the barn at 4 o'clock in the morning and some black dude hops up from behind the haystack and says, I already milked your cow, Mr. White Farmer. It's me, Andre from Detroit. I already did that shit. I took your job. That's not happening. It's not happening. I'll let y'all recover from that for a minute. But I get these emails from people, right? These white folks that'll write me like, I can't find a job because black and brown folks have taken all the jobs. Really, all the jobs? They took all the jobs? Why do they have unemployment rates that are double the rate of white folks? Where'd they take these jobs? They didn't take them far, right? What are you talking about, right? But if they've been encouraged to believe that, if I've been encouraged to believe that's why, and I've got political elites that'll use that, that's the oldest play in the book. And so all of this stuff, the NFL stuff, all of it is about trying to tell white people who aren't rich that their enemies are black and brown, that whatever problems they have in their life are about that. But let me tell you why that's a problem, other than just the obvious, like, philosophical reasons why it's a problem. This is some dangerous stuff, and I'm gonna be real serious about this, because sometimes when we talk about racism, I think there's a tendency to, for white people, to assume that anything that might benefit equity, it comes at our expense. So if you think of it all as a zero-sum game, if you think of it all as any gain for them is a loss for me, then I totally sort of understand, even if I can't really totally get my head around it and I can't necessarily empathize with it, but I can understand why you would potentially be afraid of equity, because you stand to lose something. So it's important for us to articulate a politic that explains why this inequity is actually unhealthy for all of us. Not just for black and brown folks, that's rather obvious why it's unhealthy for them, but why is it unhealthy for white folks? Because if we want to actually create white allyship and actually create solidarity around a better criminal justice system, around a better labor market system, around better education, around better healthcare, all of that, we're going to have to articulate some reason for why white folks should want to actually give up some of that privilege that we have. And see, the biggest privilege we have is the privilege of that obliviousness, that ability to be oblivious to black and brown truth. I don't have to know what you know. So I don't have to know what those ball players know. I don't have to know what black folks in 61 knew, and 62 and 63. I don't have to know what black and brown folks today know. I don't have to know any of it. And for the most part, you can be ignorant and there's no consequence historically. You didn't have to know that stuff. And there was no real cost to be paid. But I'm gonna tell you something. Right now, there's a cost to be paid. And if you're not clear on what the opioid crisis is really about, that's where I'm going right now. Because if you don't understand what this is really about, and there's nobody's going to tell you what it's really about, because they don't want to actually get into what it's really about, but I'm going to tell you what it's really about. The opioid crisis, so here, first of all, the easy part, let's get the easy part out of the way. The easy part is, it's nice, isn't it, that we have sympathy for some folks with a drug problem all of a sudden? Because we didn't have that sympathy during the crack epidemic. We didn't have that sympathy during the heroin epidemic in the 70s. But all of a sudden, white folks are hooked on some painkillers and we're like, oh my God, we got to get some rehab for these people. We got to have treatment. It's a public health emergency, y'all. Well, it is a public health emergency, and it ought to be treated like one, as drugs generally should have been, treated like a public health issue, not a criminal issue. That should have always been the policy. But that is the easy part. That is the easy part. Anybody can tell you that, and anybody can say that, and it's obvious. It's not even remotely controversial, really, among reasonable people. But here's the deeper part. So, I mean, there's a lot of unreasonable people for whom I guess that is controversial. But that's the easy part, and I don't need cheap applause for the easy part. Here's what I need you to think about. I need you to think about why it is that this particular segment of America, white, non-college educated, working class, middle-aged white folks are so disproportionately being hit by this crisis, because that's the group. A couple years ago, there was a study came out of Princeton from 2 economists that looked at death rates, mortality data from 1999 to 2013. So it's 14 years of mortality data. And they were noticing something really interesting in the data. So if you know, typically in an advanced economy, mortality rates are generally always going to decline unless there's an epidemic or a natural disaster or something horrible happens. Your mortality rates are always going to generally be going in the positive direction, going down. Life expectancy is going to go down. Going to go up, and mortality rates are going to go down. But from 1999 to 2013, even though that was true for every group, it was true for black folks, it was true for Latinx folks, it was true for most white folks, but there was one group of white folks for whom it wasn't true, and that was white, middle-aged, non-college educated, working class white people. During the same period that literally every other demographic saw their mortality rates decline, this group saw their mortality rates skyrocket. Over a 13-year period, 500,000 excess deaths. 500,000 people who died who wouldn't have died if their mortality rates had gone in the same direction as every other group. And it wasn't just like they were having heart attacks or hardening of the arteries and strokes and stuff. These were people that were dying principally from 3 things: opioid overdoses, cirrhosis of the liver brought on by heavy drinking, and suicide. These were self-inflicted deaths. They're called them deaths of despair in the media. You probably heard that terminology. When I saw this study, I remember thinking, well, this is fascinating, because if the issue is just despair, if the issue is just I'm hurting and I'm in pain, then why aren't black and brown folks doing this? Because in every economic indicator, now I don't want to dismiss the pain that these white folks are in. They're suffering, don't get me wrong. There are millions of white folks struggling in this country post-recession, have not come out of it yet. I'm not dismissing that. But there is no way of denying that black and brown folks are worse off. Black wealth, 2/3 of black wealth was wiped out during the recession, mostly because of housing valuation that was wiped clean. So if it was just about pain and economic misery and anxiety and despair, black and brown folks would be doing opioids in those same numbers. They would be killing themselves. They would be drinking themselves to death, and they're not. So explain to me why white folks are having a harder time dealing with despair than black and brown folks. And when you think about that answer to that question, you have just answered the riddle of why privilege is a setup in this country. And you have just answered the riddle as to why white folks ought to care about issues of equity. Because you see, when the society tells you that all you got to do is work hard and everything will work out, because that's what we tell people. Luckily, most black and brown folks know it's more complicated than that. Most black and brown folks never had the luxury of believing that, but white folks did. Even those white working class men who worked in the assembly lines and the factories and the coal mines, right? They had at least the belief in horizontal mobility. Right? Which means what? My granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I'm gonna work in the mine. Or my grandfather worked on the assembly line, my father worked on the assembly line, I'm gonna get a job with the union and work on the assembly line. Even those working class white men who struggle every day had the ability to believe that things would always at least be static, if not better. No black person in this country, no person of color in this country ever took for granted that they would have a job ready for them if they were just hardworking and willing to lift things. People of color always knew better. White folks didn't. We had the luxury of not knowing our country. So when black folks come up against a setback like the recession, that's just like a more extreme version of Monday, y'all. Two-thirds of black wealth gets wiped clean, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty much how shit goes. Like, that's, ridiculous and horrible, but we know that. Like, that happens. And white folks have a setback, and all of a sudden we're facing double-digit unemployment, and we don't know what to do with that. Because to us, we haven't faced that since the Great Depression. We have no idea how to even cope with that level of setback. See, James Baldwin said it best. Many years ago, he said, talking about black folks, he said, I don't mean to sentimentalize suffering, but that man who can never suffer, and he used gender-specific language, but we could say specifically, the person who can never suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they really are. Because that man who is forced to snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rages to destroy it every day learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable, because in order to survive, in order to stay alive, he has to learn to look at the meaning beneath the words. And ultimately what Baldwin says is that when one is constantly surviving the worst that life has to bring, one ceases to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. And that's the difference. People of color are not afraid in this moment. It's white folks who are freaking out. We're the ones who don't know what to make of it. Whether it's white liberals who are freaking out over the politics of the moment, or it's white conservatives and working class folks in these towns like Western PA who are freaking out about cultural change and they don't know what to make of that. Whatever it is, like, we're all sort of in a system that we don't really understand, and that's actually set us up for this moment. And now we're suffering as a result of it. And white folks are not going to get the relief that they need in Western PA or Ohio or anywhere else in this country, following the siren song of somebody that tells them that black and brown folks are to blame because they're not the source of that problem. That's not why they're hooked on opioids. They're hooked on opioids because that's the way you dull your pain, the pain that you never thought was yours to experience. And Donald Trump is just a walking, talking human opioid, because he comes along. Because what is an opioid, y'all? Pharmacologically now, just scientifically. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm talking pharmacology. This is science. What is an opioid? Opioid is a thing that only has one purpose. It blocks pain receptors. That's all it does. It doesn't actually fix your problem. If you have a crushed disc in your back, they will give you opioids to deal with the pain. That will not fix the disc. You will need surgery for that. If you have cancer, they might give you opioids to deal with the pain. That will not get rid of the cancer. You will need surgery and possibly chemotherapy in order to deal with that. Opioids just block the pain. That's what Donald Trump does. He comes along and he says, I can take away your pain and I can tell you what the source of it is. I can't actually fix it, but just take me. I alone, he said, I alone can fix your problem. He is OxyContin with a heartbeat. And these people who have been led to believe that they were never supposed to experience anxiety this way eat it up because we don't know how to deal with setback. That's fragility, as Robin DiAngelo refers to it in the white community. We don't know how to deal with setback. We've never had to deal with it on this level. That's not to say that individual white people have not, but it's to say that an awful lot of white folks had the luxury, the privilege of actually believing the lie of America. And we'd have been a hell of a lot better off if we had just listened to black folks all along and listen to brown folks all along. Our privilege is now killing us. Our privilege of obliviousness is putting us in the grave early. So I think there's a real obvious reason why white folks ought to care about this. And I think there's a really important reason why those of us who are wondering what we're going to do in this moment ought not lose hope. Here's how I know this. Because I know it's hard in these moments. You get discouraged, and you wonder what we're going to do, and you wonder how we're going to do it. And the reason I said a minute ago that this is not new, that this is the oldest play in the playbook, it's not just because that's historically accurate. I need to tell you that because if you think that this monster is new, it becomes debilitating. if you think that this monster is a new monster, it's harder to fight. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump as a human being. I mean Trumpism as a political philosophy, as a political movement. And he's not the only one who's the arbiter of Trumpism. That's just the name that we can give it now, right? If you think that it's a new monster, you don't know how to fight it. See, when I was a kid, I used to have this way I could get out of nightmares. I was really good at it. Like, I'd have nightmares like every child, right? But I developed a practice that would get me out of the bad dream. I would just blink my eyes really hard. When I saw that monster chasing me, that's what I would do. I would like taunt him because I knew I had a plan, right? Be like, oh, you think you got me, but I got this thing you don't know anything about. I'm gonna blink my eyes and I'm gonna be out of here in like 10 seconds and the monster's still coming, you know? And I'm like, yeah, and I would turn around and I would blink and I'm out, you know? And I thought I was real badass for that at 10. But what would happen is every now and then I would have a dream involving a different kind of monster, right? A new monster that I'd never seen before. And I would try the same technique and it wouldn't work until I'd seen that monster like 3 or 4 times. And I'd learned that that monster really wasn't gonna catch me. But when I saw it for the first time, I thought I could do the same thing and it wouldn't work. And I got nervous, I got scared about it. Same is true in politics. If you think that this monster is new, you get debilitated. If you understand it's the same, this is the same monster that's been under the bed for 400 years, y'all. It's the same monster that's been in the closet for 400 years. And the reason that's important is if it's the same monster, then the stuff that folks did to fight that monster for 400 years will still work. Do you understand? And 2 weeks after the election, I remember I was in DC, and I went to the African American History Museum, the newly opened Museum of African American History and Culture. If you have not had a chance to go to it, you need to go to it. It's an incredible experience. And it's especially incredible. It was especially incredible for me in that moment because if you know the physical location of it, it's at the end of the mall and it's literally 400 yards, 500 yards maybe from the White House, from the back end of the White House. And so it's sort of in between the Washington Monument and the White House over to the side of it. You can see the White House and I know who's about to move in a month. And I go into the museum and you walk through it and it's incredible. I mean, Emmett Till's original casket is in the museum and Nat Turner's Bible is in the museum, and Lester Maddox's axe handle that he used to chase black folks out of his restaurant with is in the museum. And there are slave auction blocks in the museum, and there's this statue of Thomas Jefferson in the museum that is very deliberately positioned in front of a granite wall that is lit up with the words of his, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Words that we know, of course, he did not mean, because when he wrote them, he owned 230 people. But he wrote them in any event, and the museum is lit up words as they show you his visage cast in darkness and shadows, and behind him, between the granite wall with his pretty words and his own body, is another wall made of bricks, or at least what looks like bricks. And you get up on them and you start to get a little closer and you realize that these bricks have names on them. And if you don't know what the names are, you don't have to think about it too long. They'll tell you, if you want to know, that these are the names of the human beings that Thomas Jefferson owned. And so it's an incredibly powerful moment because you start to realize in the context of this museum, right, that in spite of this man's power and this man's erudition and this man's strength and this man's intellectual brilliance for all of his evil, the reality is folks fought him and they fought the system of which he was a part, and they won. And if they were able to defeat what Thomas Jefferson, at least in part, stood for, which was the human bondage of other people, and they were able to defeat Bull Connor in 1963 and Jim Clark in Selma in 1965 and Lester Maddox in Georgia and the folks Orville Faubus in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, right? If black and brown folks have been able to stand up and defeat this monster over and over, never fully defeating them, but knocking them down every time in every generation. If Bull Connor couldn't stop black and brown folks, if Jim Clark couldn't stop black and brown folks, if Thomas...
Now, after carefully listening to Tim Wise give his thoughts concerning seeking justice through stories, the politics of fear, here is my deep critical analysis with regards to the video. So we are going to contextualize the video and I'm going to give you my deep critical analysis as promised. Tim Wise argues that fear is not merely an emotional response, but it is a deliberate political instrument employed to maintain social hierarchies and justify oppressive policies. The fear of the other person is often constructed along racial, ethnic, or religious lines, which serves to consolidate power among the dominant groups. In the American context, this has historically manifested through demonization of Black Americans, from slavery and Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration and police violence. Now, by tracing the lineage of fear-based politics, Tim Wise situates contemporary racial issues within a broader historical framework. Tim Wise underscores how political elites have long manipulated racial anxieties to distract the majority population from economic injustices. For instance, poor and working-class white Americans have often been incited to view Black people as threats to their economic security, despite sharing many of the same material concerns. This strategic division prevents cross-racial solidarity and allows those in power to escape accountability. Now, when someone is corrupt, they'll just point at the Black Americans. If they squandered money, they'll just point at the Black Americans. When they unalive one another, they'll point to the Black Americans. And so for this reason, fear develops among the white Americans. And now they start seeing we Black people living in the US as a threat to them. So you see how the system has now made fear as a weapon of suppression. Now, once they fear us, they call the police. You know how the story continues from there. Now, moreover, politicians and media outlets have consistently exploited national tragedies and economic downturns to stroke public fear and redirect anger towards minorities. After the 9/11, for instance, Muslim and Arab Americans were targeted through surveillance and hate crimes, illustrating how the fear of foreign other people, foreign in quotations, can be harnessed to legitimize authoritarian policies. Narrative power and historical amnesia. A central theme in Tim Wise's presentation is the power of narrative. Stories shape collective memory and national identity. The stories that society tell about themselves can either uphold systems of oppression or challenge them. Tim Wise points out that America's dominant historical narrative often obscure or sanitize its legacy of racial violence. This collective amnesia is forgetfulness, right? So this collective forgetfulness not only distorts history, but it also impedes progress by denying the ongoing impact of past injustices. Tim Wise insists that telling the truth about history is not an act of divisiveness, but a prerequisite for reconciliation and justice. He emphasizes the importance of centering the voices and experiences of those affected by these systemic injustice. Through storytelling, he does so. Marginalized communities assert their humanity and resist dehumanization. So it is really important we have characters like Tim Wise, characters who are able to speak and to point out to other people whatever practice that we are told is okay is not okay. Those people we are practicing these things unto are just as humans as we are. They are just as citizens as we are. And it's important that Tim Wise continue doing his oration or oratory, whatever the name. Is it oratory or public speaking? It is very, very important. Now let's proceed. The refusal to engage with history fosters ignorance and embodies revisionist ideologies. It allows for the continued erasure of indigenous genocides, the horrors of slavery, and the brutal enforcement of segregation. By confronting these truths, societies can begin to dismantle the myths and underpin systemic inequality. Then we have the next subheading to be the criminalization of blackness. You see, this is also a branch of politics of fear. You know, you criminalize blackness and you glorify whiteness. One of the most perennial outcomes of fear-based politics, according to Tim Wise, is the criminalization of blackness. Media representation and political rhetorics have long associated black identity with danger and defiance. And this is, by the way, this is so much pushed by Hollywood. A black man is always given the villain character. A black person is always given the demon character, right? Well, there's a movie called The Terminator. Not The Terminator, The Predator. The Predator is a creature from space. He comes into Earth and he starts hunting human beings. And this creature is having dreads. The people that we know are having dreads are the black people. And this predator is an invader, right? Now, a white person comes and kills it. And then he takes the head and hangs it like a trophy. Now, the person who kills it is a white man. This is painting a certain image about black people, you know? So one of the most perennial outcomes of fear-based politics, according to Wise, is the criminalization of blackness. Media representation and political rhetorics have long associated black identity with danger and defiance. This narrative justifies discriminatory policing, harsh sentencing, and the disproportionate incarceration of black Americans. Tim Wise draws attention to how political campaigns have exploited fear for electoral gain. He references the infamous Willie Horton from the 1988 presidential race, which used racially charged imagery to stoke white fears and sway voters. Similar tactics continue to be employed, often subtly, in contemporary politics. The result is a public discourse that pathologizes black communities while ignoring the structural roots of inequality. Beyond political messaging, the media plays a crucial role in reinforcing these associations. News coverage disproportionately highlights black suspects in crime stories, fostering an implicit bias in public perception. This bias manifests in lethal policing practices and judicial outcomes that disproportionately harm black individuals. Then we have the part of education and the miseducation. Another critical dimension is when Tim Wise said that education is used in perpetuating fear-based narratives. The school's curricula often omit or whitewash histories of slavery, colonialism, and resistance. This miseducation fosters ignorance and reinforces racial hierarchies. Tim Wise advocates for a racial reimagination of education, one that is honest, inclusive, and oriented towards justice. He stresses the need for critical pedagogy that equips students to question dominant narratives and understand the social political forces shaping their lives. Only through such education can society dismantle the ideological foundation of fear and build more equitable futures. In classrooms across America, the separation of topics like critical race theory and ethnic studies highlights the ongoing battle over historical truth. By marginalizing these discourses, states perpetuate the myth of a post-racial society, shielding students from understanding the deeply embedded nature of systemic racism. Structural inequality and fear is another thing as well. In times of economic uncertainty, fear is often redirected towards scapegoated groups. Immigrants, refugees, and black Americans are blamed for job loss and economic decline. Despite overwhelming evidence that structural forces such as automation, globalization, and neoliberal policies are the real culprits, and not black people or the marginalized groups. Sometimes it's easier to blame than to find a solution. This misdirection serves as the interest of the economic elite by deflecting scrutiny and maintaining the status quo. Tim Wise warns us that. Tim Wise, he warns us against the dangers of such scapegoating, urging a reorientation of public discourse towards systemic analysis and solidarity. Policies such as reform, the war on drugs, and voter suppression laws are often cloaked in languages that appeal to economic responsibility while masking racial target intentions. These policies reflect how fear-driven narratives influence legislation, disproportionately affecting minority groups while upholding white economic privilege, right? Now, there's a lot that Tim Wise continues to say in this video. So far, I'm going to stop at this point, but you can come to understand that Tim Wise is indeed a wise man with whom he has shared with us so much. We can learn so much that we can relate to. And here's something that he said. Education is not the greatest equalizer. Education is the greatest equalizer, the opposite now of equalizer. America was not made for the black Americans. America was made for the whites. And that is why the system favors the whites and does not favor the blacks and also the marginalized groups. Education cannot be individualized. He continues to say, it will lose its core values if it's about a group athlete, if it's about an individual group, or if it's about an individual culture. Education should be multi. Education should not have a scope and a limitation. It should be broad-based. Tim Wise warns us about that. I hope that you get value from all this that we do, from the videos. I'll surely appreciate for your support. Kindly subscribe. Check me on Patreon. Support me over there. I have 39 members. Only 3 are paying. 36 are there for free. But you know, your subscription helps me bring more quality content and good stories to you. Thank you. This is EFK Original Documentaries. See you in the next one.